Welcome to another edition of the Black and White broadcast. Today's episode is going to be a retrospective on John Saxon, the late John Saxon, who passed away on the 25th of July of this year. He died from pneumonia. He was 83. Such a loss. John Saxon is one of the all-time greats when it comes to character actors, those who weren't necessarily the main stars of the film but were always playing a substantial role, a substantial supporting role, very much of that guy actor who was he could be in all sorts of different things, as we'll explore throughout this retrospective. I was introduced to John Saxon in my early teens. It was A Nightmare on Elm Street that was the first film that I saw him in, and from there it just built and built and built. And I really have such a there's a big place in my heart for John Saxon. I absolutely adore that man. And you talk about a guy that you could look at and you think, yeah, that's a man's man right there. You know, a guy who's got it together, you know, a guy who you could rely on when the chips are down. Yeah, John Saxon was that kind of guy. So let's take a look then. Born August 5th, 1936, born in New York to an Italian family. He was Italian-American. Of course, got started relatively early. He was a relatively young age when he got into films, in his early 20s. We're talking 21, 22. And he really started out as a matinee idol, essentially. He was in films with the likes of Debbie Reynolds, This Happy Feeling, which he won a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer, so he made a real strong start, and then followed that up with The Reluctant Debutante with Sandra Dee and Rex Harrison. Sandra Dee was an actress he worked with quite frequently throughout the late 50s, getting into the early 60s, but as we got into the 60s, we had kind of a gear shift where he went from this matinee idol in like these classic 50s rom-com type, slickster, clean-cut, high school heartthrob, and he then moved into westerns. In 1960 he was in The Unforgiven with Burt Lancaster and Audrey Hepburn, and as we got further into the 60s, of course, starred with Marlon Brando in The Appaloosa. The Appaloosa, he actually got another Golden Globe. This time it was a nominee for Best Supporting Actor. But when you listen to John Saxon talk and look back on his career, it's clear that The Appaloosa is one of the films that he is most proud of. And that's, hey, fair enough. And obviously working with the likes of Marlon Brando, although from what I understand it wasn't the most enjoyable experience, because obviously Marlon Brando notoriously was a difficult person to work with. I also understand on The Appaloosa, John Saxon, he actually got the chance to be creatively involved, in writing or rewriting some scenes, which again, it must have been a hell of an opportunity, hell of a learning experience. But yet, it's always one of those films, when the name John Saxon comes up, The Appaloosa is one of those films that's never too far away from his name. So as we proceed throughout the 60s, another notable western is of course Death of a Gunfighter, with him and Richard Widmark. And then this carries over into the early 70s. 1972, he stars opposite Clint Eastwood and Robert Duvall in Joe Kidd. So we've got a nice a decade or so where he's been building his name. Obviously started out as this matinee idol, now he's proceeded into westerns, working with notable names like Burt Lancaster, Marlon Brando and Clint Eastwood, Richard Widmark as well. So he's becoming a name, he's becoming a face, and then that takes us really to, which is undisputably his career highlight, and obviously he's always said as much, you know, starring opposite Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon for Warner Brothers. This was in 1973. It's interesting, there was an interview with him I saw at it's on YouTube, I'm sure. It was at one of the conventions or festivals, and he said, you know, this one, Enter the Dragon, because of course he didn't know at the time, you know, you hear about all these schlocky movies coming out of Hong Kong, and obviously Enter the Dragon was billed as the first martial arts film from a major motion picture studio. John Saxon said he actually very nearly turned this down. Because again, he wasn't to know, he was thinking, but his agent had basically took him one side and said, just do it, no one will ever see it. Famous last words, it becomes, you know, the film he's most remembered for. And obviously the rest is history, but it just goes to show you weird and wonderful things like that can happen just purely by chance. You know, John Saxon going into this thinking, well, I don't know, I'll go over to Hong Kong for a couple of months, just do it, take the money and do it, no one will ever see it, and then it blows up, and like the most famous martial arts film in history. And again, you know, that was it's the peak of his career, you know, it's the role he's most remembered for. It's obviously, we talk about he usually plays more supporting roles, whereas Enter the Dragon, he's front and centre there alongside Bruce Lee, and obviously that goes to what we were saying just previously about him becoming something of a recognisable face, recognisable name. From what I understand, one of the reasons John Saxon was cast is because, again, it was the early 70s. Our American distributors were getting, and executives were getting very nervous, saying our American audience is going to come out to see a film with a Chinese guy in the lead role. Again, 70s mindset, so we need an American to share the screen. And obviously you'll notice when you watch Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee and John Saxon, their names, they're both above the title and they come up on screen simultaneously, and it was basically in order to, you know, promote the film and make the film more appealing to a Western audience. Like, yeah, fair enough, we've got a Chinese lead, but let's also put an American lead in there to help promote the film. And, you know, that's fine. And thank God that, and also, there's, I remember reading somewhere that John Saxon's agent did a bit of, you know, worked his magic and had John Saxon's role increased, made more substantial, because originally Jim Kelly's character of Williams was supposed to survive to the end, and it was supposed to be Williams and Bruce Lee who come together at the end to take on Hans Guards. John Saxon's character Roper was originally supposed to be the one who got killed, but obviously John Saxon had a good agent, and also, let's be honest, Jim Kelly, a very accomplished martial artist. He wasn't an actor, this was his first film, so you'd want to give the bigger role to, you know, the more experienced actor, the bigger name. And also, yeah, Jim Kelly was a very accomplished martial artist, but in fairness to John Saxon at this time, he was legit, he was a brown belt at this time. He had, following on from Enter the Dragon, he went to ultimately go on and become a black belt, but, you know, still a proficient martial artist at the time, so it wasn't as if we were, you know, from an action standpoint, we were missing out, because John Saxon, as you can see quite clearly, can more than handle himself when it comes to the action stuff. So obviously that was Enter the Dragon in 73, and then as we follow on, he's still, obviously that was the pinnacle of his career, but still has a very, very good career following on from that. First film of note following on from Enter the Dragon, Black Christmas in 1974, Canadian film, Bob Clark's movie. John Saxon starred alongside Olivia Hussey and Margot Kidder. Interesting story about this, and there's a making of documentary for Black Christmas. I think it's on the DVD. Almost certainly it'll be on the Blu-ray. John Saxon as Lieutenant Fuller, he was a last-minute replacement. I can't remember the original actor that got. He was either an Oscar winner or an Oscar nominee, so he was an actor of note. But basically, they'd been in touch with the agent of this particular actor. Agent had given the green light, said, "Yeah, we're good to go." They got the actor out there up to Canada, and I think, again, and my memory on this is hazy, but I'm not sure if it was some kind of Alzheimer's or dementia, or that the agent had been keeping under wraps. But basically, when the guy got to the set, he was in no condition at all to play the role, and obviously the producers were furious at the agent, thinking, well, even from a moral standpoint, how could you do this to someone? You know, this guy needs to be at home. He can't be. So obviously, we need who's going to be Lieutenant Fuller? We need a replacement, and it's too, we're in the middle of filming. Fortunately, I'm sure it was the composer for the film. He was friends with John Saxon, so he took the producers to one side and said, John Saxon would be perfect. And obviously John Saxon just coming off the success of Enter the Dragon. So the composer got on the phone to John Saxon, and Saxon obviously agreed to do it. And literally, he came from the airport to the set, and you just talk again how Enter the Dragon came very close to not doing it, and then Black Christmas, which is obviously another role that John Saxon is fondly remembered for, a last-minute replacement. But Black Christmas, again, this is obviously one of the films that is often credited with starting the slasher film genre. Really, really good. And again, John Saxon, I love him when he plays a cop, and this particular iteration of a cop with Ken Fuller, he's great. Again, he's a really good everyman in this one. You can tell he's a good cop who cares, and it's a frustrating thing. And they kind of play on this again when we get to Nightmare on Elm Street, that obviously he's one of he's a lieutenant, so obviously he's one of the higher up cops. But it's one of those situations where he's a smart cop. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's a competent cop. But the people under him, he's got to contend with a bunch of morons, and obviously that's carried over when he plays Lieutenant Thompson in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, he is on the case, he's on the ball, he's doing what he needs to do, but he's surrounded by idiots. So that's Black Christmas in 1974, and as we carry on throughout the 70s, this is where we get into we get more of his Italian stuff, because obviously it was a big thing in the 70s, Italian cinema. These films that were made in Italy and brought over to America and were geared towards an American audience. He'd been in some Italian stuff throughout the 60s, obviously most notably with Mario Bava, a film called The Girl Who Knew Too Much, sometimes going by the title of The Evil Eye. That was back in 1963. But as we get into the 70s, There's various other it's more like crime stuff, like stuff like Blazing Magnum, or its alternative title, Strange Shadows in an Empty Room, a real like hard-boiled cop thriller. And then also, and he could do both. He could play your tough cop, but then obviously he could play your sleazy mafioso. We get a good example of that in The Cynic, the Rat and the Fist, where he starred opposite Maurizio Merli, the guy out Italy's man with a tash. Obviously, we've got good old Magnum PI himself. Whereas obviously in Italy, we've got Maurizio Merli. So again, it's a typical example of an Italian crime flick. You know, you've got the rogue cop who's trying to take down these mafiosos, one of which is Maurizio Merli's the cop, John Saxon's the mafioso. It's good. And then of course there's other stuff throughout the 70s, various cult movies like Moonshine County Express, which is a total drive-in flick. We've got stuff like The Glove, of course. And then as we get towards get into the 80s, we've still got a lot of notable stuff. John Saxon really had a good career, and obviously it stretched for a lot of decades, from the 50s right up until the 2000s. But as we get into the 80s, we've got stuff like Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars. We've got stuff like Beyond Evil and Cannibal Apocalypse, of course, which again is another example of a piece of Italian cinema, the Italian cannibal movies. This was one, if I remember rightly, Cannibal Apocalypse was one of the video nasties. It's a film that John Saxon, obviously he's talked about it. It's a film he said he's not very proud of. But again, I like it, and when you look at some of the other stuff, reprehensible stuff that's come out of Italy, like Cannibal Holocaust and Cannibal Ferox, Cannibal Apocalypse really has nothing to be ashamed of when you look at those, like the Amazon cannibal movies where the they really, really push the envelope. And it's the reprehensible stuff like real animal abuse. It's disgusting stuff. Whereas when you compare it to something like Cannibal Apocalypse, but yeah, I'll just go on a quick tangent here. Obviously, I've developed quite a love for a lot of Italian giallos, horror stuff, and I've really got to credit John Saxon, because John Saxon was kind of my gateway into the Italian stuff, obviously with Cannibal Apocalypse, and then of course in '82 we worked with Dario Argento on Tenebrae, and I've got to thank John Saxon for introducing me to Dario Argento, because I've got a great love for his stuff, and obviously the way the Italian stuff looked and the way it sounded with those wonderful soundtracks. You look at the likes of Goblin, who worked on Tenebrae, and the soundtrack for Cannibal Apocalypse is wonderful. And then that branches off into other stuff, the likes of Bruno Nicolai and of course Ennio Morricone, Stelvio Cipriani. One of the things I'll be eternally grateful for John Saxon for. He's acted as kind of like this gateway into this larger world of Italian cinema. So obviously, as we continue throughout the 80s, we've got other great stuff, of course. The most famous, obviously, is going to be most famous stuff for John Saxon from the 80s it's definitely A Nightmare on Elm Street, working with Wes Craven. Obviously, we get A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, and then obviously he came back in 87 to do Dream Warriors. Again, really, A Nightmare on Elm Street and Dream Warriors, two fantastic films. That again, Enter the Dragon, clearly his career pinnacle, but A Nightmare on Elm Street is undoubtedly up there. You know, they're probably, you look at Enter the Dragon, Black Christmas, A Nightmare on Elm Street, yeah, Tenebrae, definitely, and obviously Appaloosa. Those films, clearly, there is, if you were to list his most notable stuff, they're definitely in the conversation. You can argue as to how they would rank if you were to number them, but all of them are definitely up there. So obviously, as we continue throughout the 80s, we've got other stuff like Hands of Steel, of course, and Nightmare Beach, working again with Umberto Lenzi. With Hands of Steel, of course, worked with Sergio Martino. And then obviously that takes us through the 80s, and then obviously we get into the 90s, and obviously this is kind of where things go into a second gear, if you like, because obviously things slowed down because he's getting older, and obviously all actors have a shelf life, but there was still some really good stuff in the 90s, you know. Obviously, on the Nightmare on Elm Street front, of course, came back to being Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which obviously a lot of people really like. There's stuff like Maximum Force, total schlock, where he stars alongside Flash Gordon himself, Sam Jones, Richard Lynch is in there, Mickey Rooney's in there. Again, just total schlocky early 90s cop thriller. The Last Samurai, not the Tom Cruise one, but the one from 1990 with him and Lance Henriksen. Again, total schlock, but very enjoyable. One of his later films that I really love from the 90s is No Escape, No Return. Again, it's schlocky as hell, but I love it. I remember catching it on TV years ago. It was just on one of the channels, and unfortunately I only switched over to it when it was halfway through. I stuck with it, but I'd missed the first half, so I was able to recently get the DVD and finally watch it in full, and it's wonderful. So obviously that was No Escape, No Return, and then of course the wonderful cameo he has as FBI agent Stanley Chase in From Dusk Till Dawn, working with Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino. A lovely, nice little cameo there, and again that just shows you that John Saxon is someone who means a lot to a lot of people. Obviously the likes of Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino, clearly they had a soft spot for him, and understandably so. And then obviously as we got into the 2000s, obviously slowing down again. No real big notable films. Obviously it was much smaller independent stuff that would often play at various festivals rather than anything that would be released into cinemas. Notable roles in a film called The Craving Heart from 2006 and God's Ears from 2008. They were both indie films that played on a number of different festivals. And then of course as we got into the 2010s, that was pretty much it until of course the 25th of July 2020, when he unfortunately passed away. But in addition, this was the great thing about John Saxon, he was just a working actor, you know. He was, and in addition to doing the films, he also did a ton of TV work. He was in the first ever episode of Kung Fu opposite David Carradine. He was in Streets of San Francisco, Starsky and Hutch, Wonder Woman, Hawaii Five-O, Fantasy Island, Dynasty, Murder, She Wrote, Bionic Woman, Magnum PI. All sort of on the way, going back to his Western roots. Gunsmoke. Obviously, that series, Journey to the Samaritan Strip, where obviously it was a series. Each week you get a feature-length TV movie. He was in an episode called Journey to a Hanging. He was great in that. And then obviously one of his last notable things was in 2005 in an episode of CSI, one of the ones that was directed by Quentin Tarantino. He had played a guest spot in that episode. So again, that pretty much brings this to a close on the actual going through his filmography. A man who's had such a long career, basically 50 years, and he's played all manner of different things, heroes, villains, everyman characters, really sleazy characters. And obviously this is, he did a lot of cool stuff, but obviously then there was the other side of the coin where he might have been in things where he played pretty thankless roles. But again, that's the gig of being a character actor, a working actor. And one of the great things about John Saxon as well, I love the 70s, and John Saxon, he had that great 70s leading 70s look off. Sometimes he'd play the lead role, sometimes he'd be a supporting role, but he had a great look, and he was distinctly 70s, I think that's fair to say. But a wonderful man, and you listen to what other people who've worked with him, and they have such wonderful things to say. And as he got into his later life, he was so generous with his time, going to these various conventions and doing fan signings and doing interviews and things. He was he really made an effort to connect with the fans, and you've got to admire him for that. So again, John Saxon, I really wish we could have just kept you a bit longer, but 83 years old, it's a good age, and he's left a good legacy behind. So many of his films that you can pick up and enjoy. There's so many gems in his filmography, but yeah, I absolutely adore John Saxon, and it's been an absolute delight to go back and look at his career and the great things he's done. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble about it. Again, if you're a John Saxon fan, please feel free to share your thoughts on in the comments, favourite roles, favourite memories. If for instance, if you have been lucky enough to meet him, please feel free to share that experience. But that pretty much wraps this up. I really appreciate you listening to me ramble. It's again a nice change of pace to do a retrospective on a particular actor. But again, what an actor to choose, because he was again one of the all-time greats. He really is. Again, just such a joy to watch. Always reliable. One of those, while the material he was working with might not always have been great, he was always great. So I will leave that there. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. And I will wish you all the best, and until the next time, thank you very much, everybody. Bye bye.